There are speeches, and then there are wake-up calls delivered with a Malawian accent so firm it can shake a whole cabinet into standing attention. Today, we're talking about President Arthur Peter Mutharika's inaugural address, the fiery sermon that echoed across Kamuzu Stadium and shot through the airwaves of an entire continent. If you blinked, you missed one of the most brutally honest, unfiltered speeches in modern African politics. Picture this: an 85-year-old statesman walks up to the podium, looks a restless nation square in the eye, and basically says, "Enough nonsense. The honeymoon of looting is over." The crowd exploded. It wasn't just applause, it was relief, curiosity, maybe even fear, because Malawi, as Mutharika put it, is done pretending that corruption is a lifestyle. This wasn't a gentle presidential handover filled with pleasantries and soft promises. It was a purge by microphone. It was Mutharika stepping back into power like a headmaster who left for one term and returned to find the classroom on fire. And now, the cane is out. Welcome to Global Pulse News, your global local fusion, where wit meets truth and politics gets roasted on both sides of the equator. Today we dissect 8 blazing facts from Peter Mutharika's inauguration speech, line by line, burn by burn. So fasten your seatbelts, because this is the kind of presidential speech that could make even Parliament sit straighter. When Mutharika opened his mouth, nobody expected poetry. What came instead was a masterclass in brutal honesty, the kind of talk that doesn't need a teleprompter, just courage and caffeine. Government is not a fist. Government is not a political party. Government is not a nightclub. He thundered, as if exorcising decades of political indulgence. The crowd gasped, then cheered. That one line alone will sit in Malawian political folklore forever. This was not just rhetoric. It was a declaration of war on greed, complacency, and the idea that power equal profit. Mutharika wasn't sugarcoating anything. He pointed a verbal finger at everyone, politicians, civil servants, business elites, and said, "I find you looting government money, you are detawi." A word so raw, so local, that even international journalists had to pause and look it up. That one moment bridged English eloquence with Malawian grit, the perfect linguistic handshake between global leadership and local frustration. For years, the street had whispered what leaders wouldn't dare say. Now, the president himself had said it aloud. Mutharika framed corruption not as an abstract evil, but as a disease of spirit, something internal, something homegrown. He said, "We are the people destroying our own country," his voice steady, crowd silent. And suddenly, every person in that stadium realized the sermon wasn't about them, it was about us. Transition hook. But speeches aren't remembered just for what they condemn, they're remembered for what they promise to build. So what happens when an old lion tells his pride to rebuild a broken nation? That brings us to the second fact, the moment Mutharika shifted from accusation to ambition. After the storm of rebuke came a flicker of direction. Mutharika pivoted from anger to intent, sketching out his plan to clean up the house, restore discipline, and bring sanity everywhere in government. Those weren't empty slogans. For Malawians, the phrase carried weight because discipline in his voice didn't sound like a word. It sounded like an instruction. He announced the end of what he called the spirit of destruction. The vice president, Jane Ansa, standing beside him, nodded firmly, symbolic of the dual front he said would lead this cleanup mission. Together, they vowed to reintroduce integrity into public service and to chase out the spirit that destroys our nation. For many watching, it was a rare thing. A politician admitting that the problem wasn't foreign interference, wasn't global inflation, wasn't ghosts in the treasury. It was Malawians themselves. That humility, dressed in anger, turned into hope. The speech balanced the rhythm of English political diction with the rhythm of the Malawian pulpit, firm, rhythmic, persuasive. And then came the punchline, half threat, half prophecy. "Never say I never warned you." The crowd roared, but behind the cheer was a chill, because this wasn't campaign language anymore. This was courtroom language. By the time he said, "Let us rise above our differences and save this country," the stadium had shifted from celebration to contemplation. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about repairing. It felt less like an inauguration and more like an intervention, a nation being told to sober up. Now that he had the nation's full attention, maybe even its fear, Mutharika turned outward. His next words reached beyond Malawi's borders, calling out allies, critics, and donors alike. And that's where our third fact begins: diplomacy with a Malawian heartbeat. By the time Mutharika turned his gaze to the international community, the tone in Kamuzu Stadium had already evolved, from a local sermon to a global broadcast. Gone was the scolding. In its place stood diplomacy with the sharp edges still visible. He thanked development partners from different capitals across the world, applauded the United Nations Development Program, and gave a respectful nod to SADC for supporting credible elections. But beneath the courteous phrasing was a very deliberate subtext. "We'll take your friendship, not your pity." He made it clear that Malawi does not wish to survive on charity. "We are not asking for handouts," he declared. Those 7 words might sound polite on paper, but in a country accustomed to donor dependency, they landed like a national declaration of independence. It was as if Mutharika was reclaiming Malawi's dignity in front of the world. Then came his rallying cry to global investors: "Please return to Malawi and invest in this country." Notice how he didn't say give or donate. He said invest. That's not semantics. That's strategy. It's a shift from begging bowl politics to handshake economics. He thanked the United States, the UK, and the European Union for standing against corruption and for what he called their diplomatic whispers. That phrase, diplomatic whispers, deserves its own applause. It was poetic diplomacy. He acknowledged criticism without confrontation. He turned quiet pressure into public partnership. Even his mention of Donald Trump's goodwill message, whether spontaneous or scripted, showed a savvy awareness of optics. And then came the regional roll call. Zambia, Tanzania, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, South Africa, Namibia, Eswatini, Kenya, every neighbor named like family at a reunion. It was Mutharika's way of saying Malawi is back in the community of nations, not as the needy cousin, but as a participant ready to pull its own weight. In one speech, he managed to rebuke internal corruption, thank external allies, and reposition Malawi from a donor-dependent economy to an investment-seeking partner. That's not just political talk, that's branding. Malawi, rebranded by mouth. Transition hook. But international goodwill can only go so far when home is on fire. Gratitude is good for headlines, but solutions are built in budgets. So when Mutharika switched gears and talked about the state of the nation, the applause faded, and the reality check began. There was a moment in the speech when even the most loyal supporters stopped smiling. It was when Mutharika said plainly, "We have inherited a country in a crisis." No leader likes saying that during an inauguration. But he did twice. The crowd went quiet. The tone sobered, and every Malawian watching knew this was no longer ceremony. This was diagnosis. He laid it out like a medical report. There is no food. There is no forex. There is no money in the government. Borrowing is extremely high, and nobody knows where the borrowed money went. It was less of a political address and more of an audit summary. And the honesty, brutal, undiplomatic honesty, earned him both applause and anxiety. He refused to call Malawi's predicament a curse or an act of fate. Instead, he called it a man-made crisis. That's an important phrase, because it rewrites the narrative. This isn't something inflicted by nature or destiny. It's something Malawians themselves created, and therefore something they can fix. It's accountability woven into national psychology. He added, "Our situation is not a natural tragedy, and because it is man-made, it can be resolved by humans." That line alone turned a bleak confession into a motivational anthem. It was leadership in its most transparent form, exposing the wound before prescribing medicine. But he didn't sugarcoat the path ahead.
Fixing this country will not be easy, he warned. It is easy to destroy what someone has built, but difficult to rebuild what someone has destroyed. That sentence, deliberate, rhythmic, unhurried, felt like a Malawian proverb reborn in English. It was that blend again, Western precision meeting African wisdom. His promise was not of ease, but of endurance. He said, "I do not promise you milk and honey. I promise you hard work and tough decisions." And you could almost feel the crowd's mixed emotions: respect, fear, curiosity. Because when a leader stops promising paradise, the people start preparing for progress. The message was simple. Malawi's crisis is real, but it's reversible. The country is broke, but not broken. And with that, Mutharika had successfully shifted the narrative from blame to responsibility, from helplessness to agency.
By the time Mutharika began outlining his Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, agenda, you could sense the audience leaning forward, half expecting fireworks, half hoping for miracles. And he didn't disappoint, though he didn't deliver sugar either. The DPP government, he declared, is ready to govern and ready to rebuild this country. No grand illusions, no exaggerated forecasts. Just that, readiness and resolve. But then came the deeper layer. We have a clear, comprehensive development and governance blueprint articulating a new vision and a new agenda for transforming Malawi. That's classic Mutharika, structured like a professor, delivered like a preacher. The promise wasn't just about policy, it was about identity. The DPP manifesto, he reminded the nation, was more than a campaign document. It was a pledge of transformation. And if you listen closely, his word choice was surgical. He didn't say change, he said transform. Change is cosmetic. Transformation is permanent. He emphasized that Malawi's rebirth would demand discipline, patience, and hard work. Those three words, not money, not technology, not foreign aid, were the pillars of his plan. It's a Malawian rhythm at heart. Work hard, wait long, believe deeply. And that fusion of moral tone and managerial talk is exactly what makes his leadership style unique. In a region where politicians often promise instant results, Mutharika's approach sounded almost old-fashioned, even spiritual. He framed governance as a moral mission. It wasn't just about rebuilding infrastructure or fixing budgets, it was about rebuilding the national character. That's where his message to the civil service came in like a lightning bolt. We'll clean up the house and restore integrity in government. To bureaucrats and party loyalists who'd gotten comfortable, that sounded less like inspiration and more like a warning. And when he said, "Never say I never warned you," it wasn't theater, it was policy with teeth. But make no mistake, this was also political choreography. By calling out corruption publicly, he bought himself moral credit. And that's priceless in a country hungry for ethical leadership. Whether that credit lasts depends on what comes next. Because, as every Malawian knows, it's one thing to preach against corruption and another to confront it where it lives. And that's where Mutharika's speech took its sharpest, most introspective turn, straight at the heart of the Malawian spirit. Then came the part that silenced even the loudest supporters, the spiritual confrontation. Mutharika looked past the politicians, past the media, and aimed straight at the soul of the nation. The spirit that destroys our nation does not come from outside this country, it comes from us. It was a confession and a confrontation rolled into one. For decades, African politics has thrived on the narrative that external forces, colonization, foreign manipulation, unfair trade, are the root of every crisis. But here was a sitting president saying, no, the rot is homegrown. That's not just honesty, that's rebellion against political tradition. He called it a disease of spirit, a cultural sickness that infects both leaders and citizens. And then he turned faith leaders. I ask all you leaders of faith to help us help this nation. That wasn't a courtesy shout out to the church or the mosque. It was a call to moral arms. He wanted pastors, imams, and bishops to be co-pilots in cleaning up Malawi's conscience. His gratitude extended beyond religion, too. He thanked the Catholic bishops, Muslim leaders, and Christian communities for standing up against evil, corruption, and state-sponsored terror that had plagued the country in the past 6 years. That was a heavy statement because it acknowledged how dark those years had been and how complicit leadership had become. But here's where the Malawian English fusion sparkled. Mutharika didn't sound academic or foreign. He sounded fatherly. The tone carried that local sincerity you hear at a village meeting, part stern lecture, part family talk. He wasn't just speaking to Malawians, he was speaking with them, reminding everyone that rebuilding Malawi was not a government duty alone, it was a shared moral project. And in true Mutharika style, he didn't end that segment with comfort. He ended it with conviction. Let us arise above our differences to change this country as one people. It wasn't a plea. It was a command, delivered with the rhythm of an elder's wisdom and the authority of a president's oath. What stood out most wasn't just the message, it was the tone. The old professor was back at the podium, teaching again. Except this time, the classroom was an entire nation, and the lesson was accountability. But even the most passionate teacher needs the right tools, and the biggest test of any moral mission is economics. Up next, how Mutharika plans to translate this gospel of integrity into policy that actually feeds, fuels, and funds a struggling Malawi.
As the stadium heat rose and the sun leaned west, Mutharika's tone pivoted once more, this time from moral crusader to economic strategist. "We will revive our economy," he said, his voice echoing through Kamuzu Stadium, "but only if we produce, export, and innovate." This wasn't another "we shall" moment, it was a dare, a direct challenge to every farmer, trader, civil servant, and entrepreneur. He called for production, productivity, and prudence, the 3 Ps of what might just become the DPP's next governing mantra. He spoke about wooing foreign investors, but also made it crystal clear that Malawians themselves must become investors in their own soil. He said, "We must stop waiting for others to come and build our nation for us," he warned. It was tough love, but in Malawian culture, tough love is still love, the kind that stings before it heals. Mutharika's economic pitch didn't hide the country's struggle. He talked about debt, about forex shortages, about empty reserves, but he flipped that bleakness into a call for innovation. In a subtle stroke of political artistry, he transformed scarcity into opportunity. There is no money, and that is exactly why we must create it. It sounded paradoxical, but to an audience that has lived through inflation, fuel shortages, and economic shocks, it made perfect sense. He praised local industries and agricultural resilience, saying Malawi could once again become the food basket of the region if corruption and inefficiency were cut out like weeds from fertile ground. For a nation once proud of its exports, tobacco, tea, and sugar, this was more than nostalgia. It was a business plan delivered as poetry. And perhaps the most telling line of the entire segment, "We will not beg, we will trade." That's the sound of an 85-year-old man speaking with the swagger of a startup founder. He was redefining the country's mindset from a receiver to a competitor. In one breath, he promised investors that Malawi would protect their capital. In the next, he warned that anyone stealing public money would face prosecution without pity. There will be no sacred cows, he declared. For a crowd used to hearing this phrase recycled for years, this time it hit different, because the man saying it had just walked back into office on the back of the same promise. But no matter how polished the plans or fierce the pledges, nations aren't rebuilt by policies alone. They're rebuilt by people. And that's where Mutharika saved his most heartfelt words, not for investors or donors, but for the Malawian people themselves. Every great leader leaves a speech not just with applause, but with an echo, something that lingers in the heart long after the microphones go silent. Mutharika's final act was that echo. He said, "Let us put aside our divisions. Let us unite as one people, one nation, under one destiny." You could hear the sigh of relief ripple through the crowd, not because unity is a new message, but because this time it felt personal. He didn't speak as a politician. He spoke like an elder returning home to calm a noisy family. He called out political violence, tribalism, and hatred, labeling them as the cancers of democracy. The crowd cheered, not wildly, but thoughtfully. It was the applause of a people tired of fighting and ready to rebuild. He didn't promise comfort, he promised continuity. He said, "We will move together as a family, through sacrifice, through service, and through shared responsibility." And in that moment, his tone softened. The fierce professor turned into the father figure again. It's easy to forget that Mutharika, despite his calm academic aura, has survived one of the most unpredictable political landscapes in Africa. Overthrown, dismissed, doubted, yet still returning not as a relic, but as a reformer. And that's what this speech truly symbolized: resilience. The man, the party, the nation, all refusing to quit. He ended not with a bang, but with a prayerful cadence.
May God bless you all. May God bless Malawi. A simple line, yet in its simplicity lay everything: defiance, humility, and faith. The stadium roared, the anthem swelled, and somewhere in that noise, hope quietly returned. Transition hook, outro lead. So that's the story. Not just of a swearing in, but of a swearing off of corruption, of complacency, of excuses. But what happens next? That's the million kwacha question, and it's one only time, truth, and accountability can answer. At Global Pulse News, we don't just chase headlines, we chase meaning. And this inauguration wasn't just ceremony, it was symbolism. It was Malawi's mirror moment, a reckoning between past mistakes and future dreams. Peter Mutharika didn't just retake office, he retook ownership. He stood before a nation hungry for integrity and said what few leaders ever dared to say: "We have failed, but we can rise again." And that honesty, raw, unpolished, unapologetic, might be exactly what Malawi needs. But speeches, no matter how fiery, are only blueprints. The true test begins when applause fades and reality bites. The next months will show whether this inauguration was the start of redemption or the sequel to repetition. But still, one thing is clear: Malawi is awake. The people are watching. The world is listening. And Global Pulse News will be right here, decoding every promise, every policy, and every pivot. If you found this breakdown insightful, informative, or just a little too honest for your usual news feed, then hit that like, subscribe, and bell. Not for us, but for yourself, so you never miss the truth behind the podium. Tell us in the comments, do you believe Mutharika's return can truly transform Malawi? Or is this just another circle of politics spinning again? Until next time, stay aware, stay awake, and as we say at Global Pulse News, think beyond the speech.